Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to start by sharing some exciting news. I'll be accompanying Simply Tudor Tours The Rise and Fall of Anne Boleyn tour this year, which will run from the 8th to the 14th of September. If you'd like to spend 6 days with me exploring historic sites associated with Anne Boleyn and talking Tudors to your heart's content, do check out their website for details. They've organised a truly amazing itinerary for guests, one that will blow the socks off any Anne Boleyn lover. There are limited spaces, so do be quick. Find out more and book your place at simplytudortours.com. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Charlotte Cooper-Davies to the podcast to talk about Christine de Pizan. Charlotte Cooper-Davies works on the late Middle Ages in France with a focus on the literature produced at this time. She's a specialist on the author Christine de Pizan, on whom she has written 2 books, Christine de Pizan, Life, Work, Legacy, and Christine de Pizan, Empowering Women in Text and Image. She has held various lectureships at the University of Oxford. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Charlotte. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you, Natalie?
I'm well, thank you. I've been looking forward to our conversation. So perhaps we can just begin with an introduction. Maybe you'll just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, the work you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm an author and researcher who specialises in the late medieval period in France. My background is in French studies. I did my undergraduate in French at King's College London and then moved to Oxford to do an MST and a DPhil or PhD in modern languages. I also work in research skills development for readers at Cambridge University Library. But prior to that, I was a lecturer in French at the University of Oxford. And it's there that I wrote my 2 books about Christine de Pizan, who we're going to talk about in a moment.
We absolutely are. So one of your books, Christine de Pizan, Life, Work and Legacy, that's the one we'll be kind of focusing on. So when did you actually become interested in Christine's life, and what do you think makes her such a fascinating subject?
Yeah, so it was during my undergraduate degree that I first encountered Christine, and I think it was a course on writing about women in the Middle Ages. And the text that we read was called the Epistle of the God of Love, the Épître au Dieu d'amour. I remember being really struck by this because everything else on the course had been writing about women, but written by men. And here was a woman's voice. And I became sort of fascinated by this woman. And I went on to find out just how prolific she was. And it's with Christine, it still is actually. The more I find out, the more I become interested. Every new thing I learned about her just made me want to know even more. So I started by being interested in her pro-feminine writings. Then I found out just how much she had written. I was interested at first in her autobiographical writings. Then I became interested in the relationship between the Christine in the text and the Christine, the real person. Then it was visual aspects of her work that I was interested in during my PhD. And now I work on her poetry. And I think this is why she is so interesting, that she's such a multifaceted writer. And there's so much to her writings, and she writes some really meaty material as well. So you never really get bored with Christine.
Yeah, it sounds like there's definitely lots to explore there. I love that. So perhaps our listeners have heard about Christine and some of her works, but would you maybe just introduce us to her early life and what we know of her family as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So Christine was born in Venice around 1364. We don't know exactly, but then about. And she was the daughter of a very prominent scholar at the University of Bologna. And this was a man called Tommaso da Pizan, or Thomas de Pizan, as he became known in French. And Christine moved to the French court in Paris in 1368. So she would have been about 4 years old. And the reason for the move was to do with her father, who had been appointed as the court astrologer to King Charles V of France. And from then on, she effectively spent her entire life at the French royal court.
And so you mentioned her father there. I just wanted to ask you about his role in actually sparking her love of books and of learning as well.
Yes, Christine tells us a little bit about her father's role in sparking her love of learning and books in two of her works. Firstly, the Book of the City of Ladies, where one of the characters in this reminds Christine how pleased her father was to see her. The phrase she uses is inclined to letters, so meaning that she loved learning. And this character says that her father did not feel that a woman's worth was diminished by learning, which is a kind of ironic understatement, meaning that he felt that women were improved by learning. And the second work where she mentions her father in detail is a book called The Mutability of Fortune, which is a kind of autobiography, but told through allegory. So it tells the story of Christine's background and her education, as well as her marriage and, slight spoiler alert, her widowhood. But all of this is through a metaphor. So, for instance, she describes her marriage as a voyage on a ship on which her husband is the captain, and describes how he is capsized and dies, leaving her to steer the ship. But before then, we get some detail about Christine's father and her education. And she tells us that because her father had actually originally wanted a son so that his son could inherit his learning, he ensured that when Christine was born a girl, she was still as well educated as any son he might have had would have been. Now, what's interesting about this is that scholars have tended to read this as showing that it was her father and her father alone who was interested in her education, whereas she describes her mother always trying to kind of pull her away and engage her in what Christine disparagingly calls fillas, meaning kind of lowly female occupations. But the people who are described as overseeing Christine's education are actually always female. So in the Book of the Mutability of Fortune, it's Fortune and nature who educate Christine and see that she is properly educated and brought up. And this fits with the role that Christine gave women, and as well as the role that we know medieval women had in educating their children. And, they did things like teaching their children to read. So in my other book, Empowering Women in Text and Image, I make the case that the father's role shouldn't be thought of too greatly in her education, because her father only actually appears twice in her works, and it wants to arrange for other women to educate her and wants to find her a husband. So I don't think we should diminish the mother's role too much either.
No, absolutely not. And of course, there you've told us that she did, in fact, get married. So can you tell us a little bit about that period in her life and who she actually married?
Yes. So Christine married her husband, a man called Etienne du Castel, in 1379. And there are two things about this that often horrify modern audiences, but that were completely normal at the time. The first is that Christine's husband was chosen for her by her father, Thomas. And the second is that she would only have been about 15 years old when she was married. Completely normal for a woman of Christine's status at this period in time. It's worth noting that she does hint in one of her writings that given her young age, the marriage wasn't consummated until a little later on. So listeners might be pleased to hear that.
Yeah.
And she describes this as part of the respect that Etienne showed towards his young bride. But despite the fact that they effectively had an arranged marriage, but Christine describes it as an incredibly happy one. We know they had 3 children together, one of whom was Jean Castel, who also became a writer, and they had a daughter who became a nun. We don't know anything about the mysterious third child, interestingly enough. Perhaps not a remarkable person, maybe.
And so I know from having a look at your wonderful book that Christine does face significant challenges in the 1380s. So could you tell us a little bit about this period and also how this shifts the trajectory of her life?
Yes, absolutely. So yes, as you say, this was a really pivotal time for her because the events that took place in this decade are what set her on track to becoming an author. So I think in my book, I described this as 3 losses that happened in this decade. The first was the loss of Charles V, the King of France, which was significant because he effectively employed both her father and her husband. So they were both left. The 2 main men in the de Pizan and the Castel family were left unemployed. So that led to quite a lot of uncertainty. Her father then died around 1387. So she was left with the care of her mother. And then in 1390, rather tragically, Etienne de Castel was away on a mission for the king, and the crowd were kind of hit by an epidemic, an outbreak of disease, sometimes incorrectly referred to as plague. Plague was just the French word meaning disease. And he died while he was away on that mission. But it wasn't all, it was obviously terrible when this happened, but what this meant was that Christine turned to writing, and she began by writing poetry. She didn't do this immediately. We believe she started around 1395, around which time her youngest child would have been about 10 years old. So a really tragic and difficult time, but if she hadn't been through this hardship, we might not have had any of the amazing writings that we have from her later life.
And, my listeners are probably more used to hearing about Tudor London than Paris at this point. So would you be able to just kind of set the scene, the Parisian scene for us? What is it like? What is the place that Christine is working in? What is going on politically as well at this time?
Yeah, it was a busy time. Paris in the early 15th century was very prosperous in terms of its trade and its economy. So it was a very exciting time to be a writer like Christine in Paris. The book trade was absolutely booming, and there was a real appetite for the kind of luxurious manuscripts, such as the ones that Christine prepared for her patrons. King Charles V had recently refurbished and hugely expanded the royal library at what's the Louvre Palace. And so members of the nobility were looking to kind of emulate him by extending their own libraries and book collections. So this was a really exciting time to be an author in Paris. In terms of politics, it was quite a dangerous and politically incredibly unstable time. At the time, a little conflict you might have heard of called the 100 Years' War had been rumbling on in the background since the 1330s, although it is worth noting that there was actually a truce, quite an extended truce, between the French and the English that lasted from 1389 until 1415. So for much of the time that Christine was writing, international war at least wasn't much of a threat. Internal conflict was a different matter. So I've already mentioned that Charles V's death led to some uncertainty, at least for Christine's immediate family, but it also led to uncertainty, a huge amount of political uncertainty as well. He did have a male heir, also called Charles, so Charles VI, who inherited the throne, although he was still a minor at the start of his rule. And for a time, everything was hunky-dory. Unfortunately, a decade or so into his reign, things started to go a little bit pear-shaped. It became clear that he was not actually fit to rule. So he suffered from what we now believe to be a form of psychosis. And things really came to a head when he almost died doing a stunt where he almost burned himself to death at a wedding feast in 1393. This is an event that became known as the Ball of the Burning Man. And when this happened, it became clear that a regent was needed to reign in place of Charles VI. There were 2 potential candidates for this role. First of all, there was the Duke of Burgundy, who had been regent before, so when Charles VI, was in his minority. Or there was also the Duke of Orleans, who was the king's younger brother. And by rights, the regency should have fallen to him, but the Duke of Burgundy was absolutely not willing to let this go. And this led to the Armagnac-Burgundian conflict, which, to cut a very long story short, this particular conflict only ended when the Burgundians allied themselves with the English. And so the Armagnac-Burgundian conflict and the 100 Years' War both came to an end simultaneously.
Yeah, so quite a bit of turmoil for
Just
Christine to reflect on. So let's talk about her impressive writing career now. And maybe you could introduce us to some of her most famous and influential works.
So Christine started writing around 1395, but her career really took off in the early 1400s. She composed over 40 major works between 1399 and 1420. This included many hundreds of poems, which is what she started off by writing. She wrote over 300 poems in her lifetime. She went on to write a lot of prose as well, including epistolary forms, so meaning letters, and her writings were on various themes, including autobiography, which I've already mentioned, devotional texts, historical narratives. She wrote a manual on warfare, which is actually one of the most important sources that we have on medieval tactics of war. And a lot of her work can be considered didactic, meaning that it was instructive in some sort of way. A couple of works to highlight some of her more famous writings. So the Letters on the Romance of the Rose. This is a compilation of letters between Christine and some of the leading scholars in Paris at the time. And they were writing on a controversial 14th century work called The Romance of the Rose. And Christine really took this work to task because of its language and its misogyny, the way it depicted women, which I think we'll come to a bit later on. What's interesting about the debates on The Romance of the Rose is that, firstly, Christine collected the letters and compiled them together. And she effectively edited them so that they could be presented to and then read by the Queen of France. Second, Christine's careful preservation of the debate like this means that the debate over The Romance of the Rose is actually the first in a long history of French literary debates. And the French love a good literary squabble, and this was the first one to ever be recorded. Another work which I have to mention, and I've already mentioned it so far, is the Book of the City of Ladies, which nowadays is her most famous work. And rightly or wrongly, it's sometimes thought of as Christine's kind of feminist treatise. I'll describe the opening, which is Christine is in her study and she's reading a book that she says she'd wanted to have a look at for a long time. And she finds that it's full of hatred and misogyny. And she starts thinking about this, and she has this realization that she can't think of any work that doesn't have some kind of misogyny or hatred of women in it at some point. And she's sitting in her study and kind of bemoaning, and she says, "Oh, if only I'd been born a man." And at this point, three virtuous women appear and they reassure Christine that, first of all, don't worry. It's good that you weren't born a man because you have been given this great mission. We are here to help you build the City of Ladies. And the City of Ladies it's a metaphorical city that will protect and defend women against misogyny. So a kind of city for women to live in and protect themselves from within. But it's also the title of her book. So her book itself becomes a kind of encyclopedia of famous women. So it's famous women from history and mythical sources, as well as from devotional material such as the Bible. So the book itself becomes kind of proof that there are good women, because look, you've got this enormous tome with the stories of hundreds of good women enumerated in it. And a final work I thought I'd highlight is her very last work, The Tale of Joan of Arc. And it's significant for being the only literary text about Joan that was written during her actual lifetime. And it's a real exaltation of Joan. It's such a hopeful and victorious poem. And in Joan, Christine really felt that she was seeing the female military heroine that she had been waiting for her whole life.
And before we talk a little bit more about what Christine actually thought about women and women's place in society, it'd be wonderful just to hear a little bit about the influences on Christine's own work and writing. Do we know very much about that?
Yes. So we know that Christine was extremely well read, and her writings are extremely rich in kind of intertextuality, meaning that we can pick out little tidbits from other texts that she's clearly referencing, possibly without even realizing that she's doing it. It would be too long to enumerate all of the influences on her work. So I'll just mention a couple of writers that people might have heard of. So firstly, the medieval Italian writer Boccaccio inspired a lot of the content of The City of Ladies. He had written a book called Of Famous Women partway through the 14th century. Then there's a Roman writer, 6th century writer called Boethius, who had written a book called The Constellation of Philosophy. And Christine owes the openings of several of her works to this form. And it's the kind of what we see it a bit in The City of Ladies, with Christine in her cell being visited by people who reassure her that that's drawn directly from Boethius. And finally, an intriguing question mark is whether or not she was familiar with the works of Dante, which hadn't been translated into French at this point, but it seems like she probably was. And a couple of her works, she makes use of a guiding figure called the Sibyl, who's reminiscent of, I think it's Virgil in Dante's work, who guides him. So we have the Sibyl who's guiding Christine. So it's likely that she was familiar with that as well.
It sounds like she must have had quite an impressive library. Is there any record of the books that she owned or of her library at all?
There's no records of her own. Many scholars believe that she had access to the Royal Library in Paris, so Charles V and Charles VI's library. Unfortunately, a scholar called Susanna Pine has recently shown that Christine probably didn't have access to that library, which has devastated many researchers, because for a long time we've all assumed that was the library that she was using. But it should be said that books did move a lot in the Middle Ages. You know, you had to be incredibly wealthy to own a single book, let alone to have your own library. And people did borrow things, and you know, if there were bits that you liked or that were important to you, you would copy them out so that you could keep, you know, little fragments of your own, even if you weren't able to actually own the physical book.
Yeah, I do like that practice, actually. I've been reading up on that and it's very interesting. So as you've mentioned, so The Tale of the Rose and the Book of the City of Ladies are today considered to be some of the earliest feminist writings. So can you talk to us about what Christine actually believed about women and their place in society, and maybe just some of those other big questions that she was tackling in her work?
Yes. So a lot of people who've heard about Christine have heard about her precisely because of her so-called feminist ideas. And she's sometimes referred to as one of the first feminists. And I always used to feel slightly bad for students who would come to me all excited about wanting to study Christine and her feminism, because they'd often end up a little bit disappointed. To give her fair dues, I should just acknowledge that for the time, Christine's ideas were quite progressive. So she argued for things like girls being educated in the same way as boys. She argued for better financial protection for widows. But the idea of things like female equality was just a complete misnomer for her. As a concept, this simply did not exist. There are a couple of passages that I find are quite telling and really highlight why it's so problematic to think of Christine as a feminist. One is the Book of the City of Ladies, where at one point Christine and the virtuous women are discussing the possibility of there being female lawyers. And Christine says, well, there don't need to be female lawyers because there are already plenty of men to do that. So, you know, that idea of equality not existing. And in another of her books, this is the kind of follow-up to The City of Ladies, and it's an advice book for princesses called The Book of the Three Virtues. And in it, she discusses the question of what should a married woman do if her husband is mistreating her? And Christine is very sympathetic to that plight, but she's very clear in her reply that although this is a really horrible situation to be in, well, you are your husband's servant and you need to do what he asks. And the advice she gives is, how can the woman put up with it? But she would never suggest anything as radical as, say, leaving an abusive husband. But then I think, again, to be fair to Christine, we need to remember she was addressing noble women in the 15th century. So she could never have suggested anything else. You know, she couldn't have suggested leaving a husband because, I mean, she would have lost her place at court for being scandalous and people wouldn't have read her books. So that's kind of giving the downside. But Christine is still really significant in what she wrote about women because she argued overall for them to be respected and treated better. She really wanted to put an end to misogyny and all the forms of discourse that took, and for women's contributions to all sorts of fields. So in history, in cultural production, in politics, and even in government, she wanted female contributions in all of those areas to be valued and for them to be allowed to take a greater role in official duties as well. So one thing that she pushed for was for the Queen to be allowed to do more and possibly even act as regent for her husband. And she urged her to act in ways that would help to bring about peace. And she gave the Queen of France examples of women from various sources who had done the same thing. So, showing her, you wouldn't be the first. You can do this. Other women have done it before.
Yeah, so perhaps doesn't exactly fit our definition of feminist today, but certainly she sounds to have been progressive, courageous, inspirational. So you can understand, I suppose, why people sort of look up to her today. So, of course, we have to talk a little bit about the 16th century, Charlotte. I can't let you go without discussing that. So can you tell us a little bit about the afterlife of Christine's work? Was she still being read in the 16th century? And do we know of any maybe prominent Tudor women that are reading Christine or any other 16th century women?
Yes, I've been enjoying brushing up on my knowledge of Christine at the Tudor court for this podcast, because yes, Christine's work was surprisingly popular in the early 16th century Tudor court. This was largely thanks to one manuscript, which was one of the Queen of France's manuscripts that after the 100-Year War ended was owned by the Duke of Bedford, who was married to a lady called Jacquetta of Luxembourg, who was the mother of Elizabeth Woodville. She was also the mother of Anthony Woodville, who was a kind of famous bibliophile. So Anthony Woodville translated Christine's moral proverbs in the 15th century. And when it was reprinted in 1526, it was given the title The Moral Proverbs of Christine. And this title is interesting because it suggests that the name Christine must have meant something. Otherwise, it would have just been the moral proverbs. So it was largely thanks to Anthony Woodville's inheriting this manuscript that Christine became preserved for the Tudor court. And she was quite well read in England in the 15th century, with many translations of her works were circulating at the time, although I should say they were often made anonymous, which was the case of a lot of literature in the period, so not that remarkable. Although it's worth pondering, anonymizing this work also meant that Christine's French background would not have been known. So, there were maybe two different reasons for anonymizing it. But another author, I've mentioned Anthony Woodville, but Thomas Hoccleve also translated one of her works. So the Epistle of the God of Love was translated into English as the Letter of Cupid. And then in the early 16th century, three more of her texts were printed. So there was a political work of hers called The Book of the Body Politic, printed in 1521, as was an English translation of The Book of the City of Ladies. And these were both actually second editions. So by the 1520s, there were already second editions of Christine's works being printed. And the translation of The City of Ladies is interesting because it was translated by a man called Brian Ansley, who had served Henry VII and Henry VIII. And recent editors of this translation have suggested that the arguments Christine makes in it for female rule would have been influential on the reigns both of Mary and Elizabeth I. And so it seems that the City of Ladies was quite popular with the Tudor monarchs. And we know this as well, interesting little tidbit here, an inventory made on the death of Henry VIII, so in 1547, showed that he actually had a set of 6 tapestries based on the City of Ladies, and these hung in the garderobe of Lady Elizabeth, so the future Elizabeth I. And these were enormous tapestries. They were described as roughly 8 by 5 meters each. So a set of 6 tapestries, 8 by 5 meters. So, they clearly had quite a strong impact on, maybe Henry VIII, maybe Elizabeth herself. We don't really know the history of how those came to be made. And sadly, they don't survive. I read somewhere, apparently Henry VIII had 2,500 tapestries.
He did.
At one point. Yeah, and only 30 of them have survived. So yeah, sadly, these aren't among those that did survive. And just finally, another of her works that was translated around 1540 is a kind of hybrid work called the Epistle of Athea. And I felt I had to mention this because it was her most popular text during her lifetime by quite a long way. And it's an unusual text because it's kind of part advice for princes, part Trojan mythology. It's partly also a devotional book. It's a kind of biblical reading of Trojan myths. But what's interesting about this edition that was made in the 1540s in England is that it really foregrounds the female authorship of the text. It doesn't mention Christine, sadly, but it does highlight the figure of Athea, who's the fictional author created by Christine. And there's a lovely image of her delivering the letter to the male recipient at the start of the book. So yes, in the early 16th century, at least, it's safe to say that Christine's works would have been quite well known to wealthy book owners. But then, like much medieval literature, her works then fell into obscurity around the middle of the 16th century, and they were rediscovered thanks to feminist writers in the late 19th and early 20th century.
That's also fascinating. So I suppose that it's not too much of a stretch then to perhaps imagine people like Catherine of Aragon and Boleyn, both of which were so erudite and both bibliophiles, perhaps reading Christine's work at the time.
Absolutely, yes. And I've often wondered about Catherine Parr as well, because Parr, she did a lot of what Christine had done as well. So not impossible.
No, we'll have to go check through all the inventories to see if any of Christine's works turn up. Charlotte, how fascinating. But I can't let you go just yet because there is one more thing that I'd like to do on Talking Tudors. And this is just what I call 10 to go. So these are just 10 very quick little questions just to get to know you a little bit better. So the first one is a favorite historic site.
Oh, it's almost too predictable to say Paris, isn't it?
Oh, no, that's...
I live in...
It fits the context.
I live in rural... I live in rural Cambridgeshire, so not that far from Norfolk, where there's all sorts of fantastic kind of Tudor goodies. I've been getting into the Tudor period recently, actually, so this has been quite timely for me. But yeah, Paris and I mean any ruins I can get my hands on, so two quite different environments there.
Yeah, I love ruins too. I think it just activates the imagination more, sometimes more than the properties that are kind of still standing. And because we all love books here at Talking Tudors, what is a book that you're either currently reading or one that you just read recently?
So I'm actually, as part of my Tudor phase, I'm currently reading Gareth Russell's biography of Catherine Howard, which I'm absolutely loving. I went to see Six the Musical last year and I became absolutely obsessed with Catherine Howard. The song, Catherine's song in that musical had me in tears and I haven't been able to get it out of my head. So I felt I had to go away and read more about this particular queen.
Oh, I love Gareth's book. That is my favourite biography of Catherine Howard, so I'm so glad you're enjoying that. And what about when you're working and you're writing? Do you have any rituals that you like to follow?
It's funny, I actually teach academic writing, kind of how to get motivated and different tips and techniques to try. And one of the ones I always recommend, and it's one I use myself, is the Pomodoro technique, which is just you write like mad for 25 minutes, then have a 5-minute break. And then you repeat it and do another 25 minutes, another 5-minute break. And then after you've done that 4 times, then you have a longer break of maybe an hour and get up and have some lunch, do some stretches. And I'm a big advocate of the Pomodoro technique. It works really well for me.
Oh, I never heard of it. I like that. I'll have to look into that and give it a go. So when you were a child, Charlotte, what did you want to be when you grew up? Have you always been interested in history and writing?
Always interested in writing. I've probably always wanted to be an author of some kind. So it was a real dream come true to have my name out in print at last. I always thought I'd write fiction rather than history. History I came to quite late. But I guess, people think of me as a historian sometimes, or sometimes even an art historian, but my background's in literature. So It's been a really interesting sort of shift into history, really.
Yeah, well, you never know. A novel may be in your future. Who knows? It's never too late. And what about a new skill that you might like to learn?
Oh, a new skill. I would love to perfect my Spanish. I have very rudimentary Spanish. I've done a bit of hiking down in Spain, but I've never really mastered the language.
Yeah, language is so important. I wish I knew more as well. And what about a travel destination that you would like to visit in the future?
Le Puy in France. So I also work on pilgrimage, especially in the Middle Ages. And Le Puy was a real centre for pilgrimage in the Middle Ages. And it's very dramatic. It's kind of in the mountains. If you look it up, it just looks absolutely spectacular. I'm dying to go there.
Oh, now that you mentioned pilgrimage, I'm desperate to do the Camino, the French way to Santiago de Compostela. I'd love to. Yeah, that's definitely on my list. My sister's done it twice. So I really, I hope maybe in the next sort of decade to to get that
Yeah,
done.
highly
I'd love to do that.
recommended. I've done it twice as
Have you
well.
done it twice as well? Oh, did you find it an
Yeah.
amazing experience?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely fantastic. And there's so much, just so much history, so many medieval goodies along the way. It's fantastic.
That's the added bonus, I think. I love that. And what about, do you have a favorite author? And this doesn't have to be anything to do with history, just somebody that you like to read and go back to.
In French, Annie Ernaux, I absolutely adore. Oh, I read quite a lot of, I'm trying to think, Bernardine Evaristo, I've been really enjoying as well lately. I'm just looking at my piles of books around me.
Yes, you've got a lot of books.
Those two. Yeah, those two. But yeah, Annie Ernaux is a big favorite of mine.
Wonderful. And one final question. So what do you like to do to relax and unwind?
We've mentioned the Camino de Santiago. I love a good hike. We have 3.5-year-old, so it's a little bit tricky to do at the moment, but I'm a very keen runner, and yeah, I'm a runner and I'm a knit.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love that. And the very final thing, and I'll let you get on with your evening, is our Tudor takeaway. Or in this case, it doesn't have to be a Tudor takeaway, but just something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode.
Yes, so thinking of suggesting the British Library's manuscript, the Queen's manuscript, which is Christine's most famous manuscript. There's a fantastic digital copy of it on the British Library's website, but it's been out of action since the British Library's cyber attack a year ago. But if you're listening to this in a few months' time, hopefully it might be back up by then. But I did find there's a lovely blog post from the KBR, which is the Royal Library in Belgium. And if you just Google KBR and Christine de Pizan, they have a lovely blog called Christine de Pizan, A Feminist Before Her Time. And it's got some lovely links to some of the incredible manuscripts of Christine's that they have there. So I thought people might enjoy having a little bit of a look at that.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. And I'll have a look at that and add the link to our show notes to make it nice and easy for everyone. And hopefully the British Library manuscript is back up and running soon. Charlotte, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on the podcast and tell us all about this, wonderful woman, Christine de Pizan.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On the Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.